Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're just waiting for the room to fill up. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very excited that you're here with us this afternoon for this panel, which is called COVID-19 Remote Learning and Working for Law Students and Lawyers with Disabilities. This is a program that is co-sponsored by NALP, which is the National Association for Law Placement, the ABA Commission on Disability Rights, and the ABA section on Civil Rights and Social Justice. This work is part of a project that came together under the leadership of ABA President Judy Perry Martinez, who is particularly interested in supporting law students and lawyers with disabilities. Today's program will be about an hour of content, and then we will have about 15 minutes of time for your questions. We encourage you to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function, and we will take time at the end to respond to as many questions as we have time. We will be sharing a recording of this program when it is done, so everyone who has registered will get a link to that recording. It is also being live streamed on YouTube. And with those preliminary logistics, we are going to get underway. I want to introduce you to each of our panelists, and then I'm going to let them each say something about themselves. Jennifer Braden is the Assistant Director of Counseling and Student Support at Columbia Law School. Bob Dinerstein is the professor of law and acting dean at American University Washington College of Law here in Washington, D.C. And Michael Sabella is an associate at BakerHostetler. He's a commissioner with the ABA Commission on Disability Rights and the chair of the ABA Business Section's Lawyers with Disabilities Involvement Subcommittee. My name is Jim Leipold, and I am the executive director at NALP, and I'm very happy to be here. And my little piece of paper just went away. There we go. Okay. What I would like to do is give each panelist a moment to introduce themselves and just say a little bit about the work that they do and their connection to disability work and disability issues. Maybe Jennifer, we can start with you, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm the Assistant Director of Counseling and Student Support at Columbia Law School. I've worked in the world of education for over a decade. I'm a JD, but I'm not a practicing attorney, and my primary professional interest has been accessibility, accommodation from a pragmatic standpoint, working with students of all ages.
That's great. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Sabella. I'm a senior associate at BakerHostetler in New York. I'm in the bankruptcy and restructuring group. I am, as Jim said, a commissioner on the ABA Commission on Disability Rights and chair of the American Bar Association Business Law Section Attorney with Disabilities Involvement Subcommittee. And my connection to disabilities, I'm also here.
Great. Thank you. And Bob?
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon. My name is Bob Dinerstein. I'm, as Jim said, the acting dean of American University Washington College of Law, which I've been all for about 12 days. Before that, and I've been a professor of law at American for a number of years. I've also been I founded and direct our Disability Rights Law Clinic, in which we represent clients and families with disabilities in a wide range of areas. My substantive area of interest has been disability rights over many years. ADA, UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, supported decision-making, a wide range of issues. I also am a commissioner on the ABA Commission on Disability Rights, and I'm happy to be here today.
Great, thank you. So, you know, this move to remote working and remote teaching was something that happened suddenly and on an emergency basis in mid-March. And now, you know, here we are midway through July. And so I think it would be a good way to start if we could just take some time to reflect on what the challenges were in making that emergency transformation, and also what are some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 3 or 4 months of doing that. And maybe Michael, will start with you from the work perspective and hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, happy to do so. So what went well? Well, it all happened very, very fast across the entire country. Everyone had to go remote. A lot of states had quarantine orders. And so the legal industry didn't want to lose the work being done. So what was initially done for people on a case-by-case basis, whole firms had to now go essentially remote. And so what happened there was you had rapid acceleration of technology being disseminated for people to work remotely, such as Zoom, teleconferencing, access to records in the office. And that was great. And it gave people the chance to continue to do the work that they were doing in the office, but be able to do it at home. And some firms said, stay home for as long as you want. Some companies said the same thing. Some have set schedules. And it's been very nice to see the firm trying to adapt to the current environment that we all find ourselves in. But it didn't come without any bumps. And one of the things that happened is that technology, while being rapidly disseminated, kind of suffered a little bit too. So you would have calls that would drop in the middle of meetings. You would have people trying to call into, for example, in my office, you would call in and you couldn't connect with the system because so many people were accessing the system at the exact same time. I mean, simply stated, the system hadn't been designed at that time to handle the amount of people that were telecommuting and working in this manner. And there were other considerations. For example, Zoom was being used, and there were security concerns initially with the access to that system, which are being addressed by firms and companies around the country and being more and more readily accessed by people, such as this example, for example. And so what lessons have we learned from this whole thing? Well, we've learned that remote work can be done. And unfortunately, for people who suffer from who have a disability and requested access to this kind of work before, they suffered because they were not permitted to, in many cases, by firms. It was considered, we want you in the office. And so the accommodations that have now been made on a mass scale for a lot of people, for those in the disability community, really wasn't given to us initially. So it's great to see the industry moving this way, but it's just frustrating for some in the community that took this long to get there. And on top of that, people do have families at home because of COVID. So if you are working and you have children you're taking care of or elderly parents or someone needs care, that itself is also playing a factor in how people being able to access their work and do their work.
And Michael, did you find, or do you know either from your work or personal experience for people who had disabilities and maybe had accommodations at work, as we transitioned to remote working, were there additional accommodations that were needed? Were those accommodations still in place? Was it more difficult or actually easier? And I know it probably depends on the disability and the accommodation.
It does. The different disabilities require different accommodations, and the type of disability may affect you. Someone could be hard of hearing, someone could be deaf, and the accommodation needed for that person or the person could be different based on their specific disability and what they are personally dealing with. So it's been nice to see that access has been given. It's just taken a little bit of a while to get there. And it's just a matter of degrees as to what needs to be done. But a lot of firms are trying, mostly because it's not for people who are for the disability community, but because they have to. They need to give this access to their employees, both attorneys and staff, if they want the work to be done on behalf of the clients. Because otherwise the clients will go somewhere else. If you shut down, nothing to get done, and your clients will go to a competitor.
Right. So the accommodation became compulsory for everyone.
Kind of.
Bob, I'm going to start with you on the school side and remote teaching. You were part of implementing this on an emergency basis. How did that go? What went well? What would you do differently? And you're muted, Bob. So there we go.
Yes, thank you. I'm compiling a list of Zoom rookie mistakes, and that's certainly one of them, to start talking before you unmute. Yeah, I want to actually start with something Michael said, because I think, to me, one of the important things we learned here is that accommodations that prior to the pandemic might have been thought of as impossible have now become inevitable. And part of it is because circumstances change. I think it allows us to have some insight as to the way we think about accommodations. And one of the important things about the period we've been through is because everybody has been limited in certain ways, things that might have before seen like as elements of special pleading are now simply things everyone needs. It could have the effect over time of actually destigmatizing some of the accommodation discussions that we've had. So I wanted to make that point. I would say that I was pleasantly surprised by our ability, that is of teachers and students, to turn very quickly, to be with almost no notice, to be told, okay, in 10 days, you're gonna go remote. You have to, change what you're doing. We all, of course, had developed syllabi and curricula that were not designed for online teaching. And so we had to adjust what we were doing to fit that. And like anything else, we're, design it in one way and have to change it later, something we well know in the disability world. There were some things that that were possible to redesign and work well, and some things that were not. So I was surprised, for example, again, as I mentioned earlier, I teach in a clinical program, and one of the things we were planning to do in the weeks that were subject to online teaching was to have students conduct direct and cross examinations in class. So one student would be questioning a witness, another student would be objecting and cross-examining, and then we would critique it. And we sort of wondered, how are we going to be able to do that when all we've got is people on a screen? And I was surprised that it actually went as well as it did. We had to change things a little bit, but example of the way we're looking now would be as if Jim was the direct questioner and Jennifer was the witness and Michael was the opponent, that you could ask your question. You had to deal with a little bit of the delay that comes from dealing with video and audio, but somebody could object and somebody could answer. And there was a semblance of the kind of class that we wanted to put together. So that was the good thing. What I learned about the challenges, in addition to some of the ones that just have to do with the technology that we know, is that at the end of the year, when we talked to students and said, well, how was it for you? How did this transition go? A number of students said, I just found it hard to maintain my attention span working on, being on a Zoom screen for more than like a half hour at a time. That would hit a point where I just couldn't pay attention. And I must say, as a teacher, we depend a lot on looking over the class, seeing how people are responding, whether you're making eye contact, whether they're nodding their heads, whatever. And you can't really always tell that from Zoom because, someone may be looking at you, or you think they are. In fact, they're on email and they're kind of got you on in the background. And so I learned from talking to some students that, it was a little bit difficult. They would lose some concentration. Also, I think we learned from students with non-visible disabilities, particularly with anxiety and tendency toward depression. This was a difficult time. One of my students, lived alone in a studio apartment. And, when we did the kind of beginning of class check-in, how are you doing? It was clear that she was suffering. Now, the good news, I guess, was that that class was an opportunity for her to connect, something that she missed being able to do in person because of the COVID virus. But the bad news is that, we were kind of there with her, which could be both supportive, but also maybe a little intrusive. And so, we're used to being in a physical space where everybody is there. People aren't, wearing shirts and ties to class, thank God. But, people they're going to their business, which happens to be going to school. Well, now, you got someone sitting in their bedroom, their dog is walking across the screen, there are different things that are going on. It's at some level, fun and actually humanizes people. But at another level, it could be seen as a bit intrusive. And for folks who were struggling with their own health, who were in family situations where there was somebody that was struggling with that was a bit of a challenge. So I think we got the benefit, I thought, of people saying, well, in the short term, we just have to get through this. The challenge, and I think we'll get to this later on in this webinar, is, well, what do we do now when we have a little bit of time to plan? I think the expectations appropriately will be higher for teachers, and we are going to have to step up.
Thanks, Bob. And Jennifer, your perspective working directly with the students with disabilities at Columbia, what went well for them in this emergency remote semester, and what was more challenging or problematic?
So I worked a lot with students and with professors. And of course, the biggest challenge was transitioning into this modality of teaching that was really unfamiliar to most educators and most learners. And that in many ways seemed, opposite of what we think of when we think of a typical law school classroom as it's existed for, generation after generation of law students. I think the biggest ostensible challenge was adjusting to that new technology and navigating that technology in the pragmatic sense, and settling upon a bundle of default settings that remove the barriers to education that were created by transitioning to this new mode of instruction. And some of those were simple fixes. So for example, this, and this is really something that I walk a lot of professors through, this idea that saving to the cloud sometimes streamlines the process of actually getting recordings to students, as opposed to saving those recordings locally. But then others require these huge shifts in how we think about learning, how we think about law students learn. So for example, what does student engagement look like in this new environment? And how do we maintain engagement in a learning environment that is not purely synchronous anymore? And how do we measure like the level of student engagement without those visual cues that Bob referred to? The cues that cited professors and lecturers are going to rely upon to guide a course meeting. And to what degree we have to ask ourselves, is relying upon those cues actually student-centered? For example, if I'm a student who's blind and I'm relying upon what I hear in order to access content, then who are we really having the student log onto a device that has video capability for? How does that really respond to how he's learning? Or if I'm a student that requires software or hardware to access the instruction, and I'm actually using that software within the course of a course meeting, I don't appear to be engaged, but I may actually very well be engaged. So those cues can sometimes be deceptive, as Bob referenced. We also sort of as a learning community have to think critically about things from an equity perspective. And from that perspective, some things that were initially viewed as challenges are also simultaneously wins for other students. A big example for me as an administrator who works directly with students with disabilities is the availability of course recording, particularly on the Zoom platform. Just providing that on a blanket basis for all students removed a number of barriers to access that we would have otherwise had to sort of grapple with on an ad hoc basis. For example, one of the big ones that I always hear students complain about under ordinary circumstances is mic use in a lecture hall. This is something we don't always think about. So often people responding in a law school classroom, or even the presenter themselves may say, I'm projecting, people can hear me. But for a person who has limited hearing, this is not always so. And if you're a person who's relying upon recordings to access instruction, it's really problematic because you will miss the entire portion of the lecture wherein this person has been projecting. That portion of the lecture is now useless because the recording just didn't pick it up. In the post-COVID environment, that concern is totally eliminated. Everyone on Zoom calls is by definition using their mic. Another example of something like that is, say, you're a student who's experienced an exacerbation of a disability, either an existing disability or a temporary disability that impacts attendance, and your professor doesn't ordinarily record their courses. Many professors are resistant to those course recordings, but this is a time-sensitive issue for those students who fall into that category. This is something that needs to be addressed with urgency. The time and the effort is not spent in the post-COVID environment. And at the end of the day, it worked out fine. Professors taught and students learned, and the world continued to turn. And, just as Bob and Michael alluded to earlier, when you have that experience, you have to ask yourself, how much of this stuff could we have been doing all alone?
And Jennifer, how about something like closed captioning? Were you able to implement that quickly with the Zoom feature?
Right. So one of the hiccups that we experienced was that you can access captioning in a number of different ways. And one of those ways, the student has to have a separate window open for captioning. And in another way, you can have the captions embedded in real time, but it requires a little bit of tech savvy. So there was a pragmatic aspect to that in terms of navigating and coordinating individuals who were tech savvy to sort of implement those sorts of solutions with professors who were not necessarily as tech savvy.
So that's a good transition. I think it's becoming clear to all of us that what we started out doing on an emergency basis is going to be required of us for some time. And certainly some portion of learning this fall across the country, undergraduate, graduate, professional, will have to be done remotely, maybe in hybrid form. And an increasing number of workers are going to be working from home, including in law firms, well beyond this summer, regardless of what happens with the virus. And so I guess my next set of questions are, what can we do better? What does remote learning and remote working 2.0 after the virus look like? And what are some of the goals you all have to do it better the second time around? And I guess we'll start with you, Jennifer, as we ended with you, and then go back around the circle the other way.
So I was talking about course recording and how normalizing course recording was sort of, we could view it as sort of a hill that we all had to make our way over together last term. I would love to see other accessibility related best practices also become normalized and to see them sort of interwoven as a pedagogical default going forward. And that's where concepts like universal design for learning principles come into place. And that's when you start to ask professors and learning communities to approach course planning and instruction with a more flexible framework that considers and is responsive to a more diverse set of student needs that may have traditionally been considered during those stages. And from a pragmatic standpoint, what that ends up looking like is that accommodation occurs at the planning stage and is not something that we sort of fix and post. And that's exactly what happened with course recording. It became something that was the default that occurred in the planning stage and not something that we arranged after the fact. But beyond that, beyond recording courses as the default, other steps that, sort of achieve a similar goal, including making sure that the recordings are captioned, as you mentioned, or as a bare minimum to include auto transcription as a default in Zoom settings so that transcripts can be generated after the fact, particularly in the event a course is not necessarily synchronous. Things like providing accessible PDFs to students as opposed to relying upon like an assistive technology specialist to do so whenever those texts are sort of incrementally provided throughout the course of the term. Things like providing DOIs or digital object identifiers in a syllabus so that students can have access of, to the best quality version of a material as opposed to a copy of a copy of a copy, which is sometimes what students get. And those sorts of things, they're beneficial to everyone, not just students with disability. Providing accessible course materials, including things like presentations and advanced instruction, that's helpful for everyone to frame their learning, but it's particularly helpful for students with certain disabilities. Describing information that's provided in a graphical format, I would love to see things like that normalized, because if you're a student who has limited sight, you can't necessarily access that information until after the fact. And of course, from a student engagement standpoint, that perhaps means relaxing certain standards and expectations. For example, a big one was requiring that video be on during a course. And doing so, if you relax that, you're sort of recognizing that in an online course environment, students who may be experiencing illness or the exacerbation of a disability and who might have ordinary circumstances just foregone attendance altogether may actually be, in the course environment. And they're able to attend that course in real time in that digital environment, but they're still visibly ill. They still may need medical breaks. They still may need comfort breaks. And they still may be actually experiencing the symptoms of their disability. And you don't necessarily need to bring attention to that student who's participating in that manner. And that's sort of when this idea of should we or should we not sort of shame students into using their camera, that's when that question sort of come into place. Another thing that I hope perhaps is rethought is cold calling. And, I know this is how we were all sort of raised, so to speak, in the legal profession, cold calling, but I've noticed that some of the professors at Columbia have taken up what I think is a very fantastic practice, which is a sort of modified cold calling where students are on call on a schedule. And so, you know that, if you're a part of this particular group, you're more likely to be cold called on this particular day. And so you have the opportunity to prepare. You have the opportunity to give a heads up if something is wrong, if you're experiencing an exacerbation of your disability. And if the camera use is very important to that professor, they could require students that are on call for that particular day to have that camera on, while not necessarily putting all that pressure on the remainder of the students. I think that as a community of educators, we're all sort of discussing what these norms could look like. And I think as we discuss those norms, we're sort of in a very intuitive and organic way, becoming more accessible environments.
That's great. Super helpful, Jennifer. Bob, how about as you lead a law school, what are you hoping 2.0 will include that it didn't on an emergency basis?
So I want to pick up on an example of something that Jennifer was saying that actually happened for us, which was not about a disability. We had a student who gave birth in October. So at that point, she was out on leave and came back in the spring. And we got a notice that she was going to need an accommodation, which although not said, I think was clear, there was going to be times when she'd need to take a break from class in order to breastfeed her child. So, that was fine. We were fine with that. Then we went remote. And what we found was that she could participate in the class. And when she needed to feed the baby, she just muted her screen and muted the audio and was able to listen to things. So she was actually able to participate, even though, and of course it was completely appropriate that it be blank during that period. So, that for me was like an example of something where there are some, and as Jennifer said, there are people who could participate in some fashion, even if not everything was not kind of going on all cylinders in a way that normally they would not be able to. But I think it's important in saying that, as a teacher, you might say, as we were saying earlier about wanting to address cues, you might say to students, I want your camera on because I need to see your faces so that, we can kind of have an interactive class. But that might expose inadvertently a student who, because of a disability or otherwise, is not in a position to want to be seen. And I think you have to be very careful to not be overly curious, which is, I think, a tendency that law professors may have. They actually have to rein in because it has implications for ADA and other kinds of discrimination purposes. So I think that's one thing. I think, we did some very quick training last spring with our folks who do online education about how to use Zoom, how to make sure your lighting is good, but it was all just kind of like very seat of the pants. Now we have an opportunity, first of all, to know what capabilities Zoom, or if you use another type of platform, might have. So one important one is there's an opportunity to have breakout rooms, right? So instead of just having everybody in a big classroom, you can put people into breakout rooms and have them have discussions, which can then simulate the kind of thing you might do in a large class and maybe even make it easier. Now, there are limitations on what that is, but I think that's one possibility that's there. And another is, of course, going along with the idea that too much time staring at a screen just becomes too difficult, is do some recording of asynchronous content. Let people watch, don't make it too long. Give them sort of bite-sized opportunities to review things. Have ways of making sure they've done it, prompts and kind of feedback that you're going to get from them. And then use the time of the in-person class, which is now online, to have the kind of interactive discussion that we take as key to legal education. When I taught my disability seminar for many years, I used to get to the point about reasonable accommodation and say, well, all right, here we are in class. What if we had a student who said, I want to take your class, but I can't come to class. Please, you have to permit me to do it. And we would talk about how for a law school class, interactive discussion is an essential function if we were treating this almost in an employment context. Well, over time, technology said, well, okay, but what if you're not in the room, but you could participate remotely? What if you're getting the lecture simulcast so you can actually participate in real time? You got to the point where you could simulate pretty close to something that was in-person type of education. And so now being forced to do that, we're able to do things that we could have done before, but we didn't feel the need to do it. And so that's really important. And I also want to second what Jennifer said about recordings. At some level we should say, well, we should have always been making recordings available for those who might have needed it. But faculty, I can tell you, have real resistance to that. I think partly it's because of some had concerns about intellectual property, that somehow their pearls of wisdom were going to be disseminated. I'm not sure they were properly thinking about just how important those were, but that's the way they thought of it. Or that if people got a recording, they wouldn't need to come to class because they could just get the recording after. But now that it's needed there, or it's even automatic in some fashions, I think there's less of a barrier to that, and that's important. So I think as we look at the kinds of things we need to be doing, again, it's more, I think it is an opportunity in this moment to be looking at more universal design kinds of things, to not get so hung up in a sense on, is this an ADA level reasonable accommodation and all the documentation you need, but just say, this is just something we ought to do, because broadly speaking, lots of people are facing different levels of challenges, and it's very difficult for us to know what people's individual challenges are, and we don't really need to know in a way that could be seen as intrusive. What we do know is that everyone is not in the same situation, so that we've got people who are particularly vulnerable. We know that people of color are particularly vulnerable. People of color with disabilities may be doubly vulnerable. And we want to be attentive to those kinds of things and not fall into the trap of somehow creating the new normal and then sort of worrying about whether people participate. And last thing I'll say, in some sense, it was easier in the spring because, at least for us and for many schools, everything was online. It was, our building was, you couldn't be in the building, everybody had to do this. Now we face a particular challenge, which is many schools, mine included, are coming back in a sort of hybrid way. There will be some in-person education, most of it will be online. Well, then we're going to get into situations, well, who's here, who's not here? People will be, well, why is so-and-so not in class? Oh, I wonder what that's going on. And so in a sense, and we'll get to this, I think, a little later, concern about the individual potential for stigma and other things that might be happening that I think we have to be careful about. And not in the law student level, but I've seen it in, for example, the special education work we're doing, as some schools for elementary and up through high school are reopening. Some kids are going to be able to come back and some are not. And some who are not, they may fall further behind, and there's going to be particular pressure on them. So I think the possibilities here are interesting. I think we can be more creative in what we do. I think legal education post-pandemic is going to look very different from what it looked like pre-pandemic, if we get to that point. But there's some definite risks that we're facing as well.
Thanks, Bob. I do want to come back to that last point you raised in a minute, but I want to turn to Michael and just say, on the work front, so as this extends now longer term, what are some of the things that law firms in particular and employers generally could be doing better? What have we learned over the last 4 months?
So I'll start with some of the things that Bob just said. The interaction for attorneys in the office is almost as important as the interaction between a professor and the student in the classroom, being that, for junior associates have the chance to network with mid-level senior associates and partners when they're in an office. A partner walks by, an associate walks by, you're at an event, you're in the kitchen, just a chance to say hello and get to know someone who may have just started. But now in this era of COVID, you're not having those communal experiences anymore. So how does that junior associate then get exposure to those above, who will then give that associate work to do? And that's something I think firms need to sort of wrestle with and figure out how that's going to happen. For example, we have summer associates this year, but it's all remote. So in prior summers, you would have events with the summer associates, you would have they do work with you. You don't have that anymore. So now you have to figure out, well, how am I going to meet the summer associates? How are they going to meet me? How are we going to figure out how to work on a case? And you sort of have to get used to the idea of doing these Zoom meetings, having a coffee break with a summer associate or a first year associate, to give them that chance to sort of meet these people, because you meet your mentors in the workplace a lot of times, as well as meeting your mentors when you're networking at events after work. And those are things that aren't happening. So I really think attention needs to be paid to those just entering the profession, including the ones that are currently in it. But they're losing out on those personal connections that were made in person that now they no longer have. So I think that's one thing that firms need to be actively trying to address in making sure that they don't lose people along the way. I mean, the old adage was that the partner always wanted to see you in the office, passed when the partner left. So they could have FaceTime, which is great, but now there's no FaceTime anymore. We're all remote. And it's not as accessible for them to access these people and get this kind of feedback that they would want. And I have junior associates that I've worked with personally, but I know them from my past few years of working. but I don't know the summer associates coming in or the first years coming in. So it's harder for me to make that connection. It's easier for me to say, I'm going to give this assignment to X because I know X versus Y because I've never met Y. And Y may be fantastic. Y may be great at his or her job or their job. And it's just, you just don't know anymore. So that's one thing I think firms need to be aware of and try to figure out and grapple with how to handle. The other thing is again, touching upon what Jennifer and Bob said, what do you do now? I'm a litigator by trade. I'm used to mediations, depositions, trials, and I'm used to them all being in person. So now I have to get used to the fact if I'm doing a deposition, usually if I'm doing a deposition, I want to be able to see the witness in person so I can see if there are visual tics that show that they're nervous, that they may be lying, or that the lawyer is not sending them a message across the table like answer this instead of Y. And now if I'm doing a deposition like this, and I'm asking Bob a question, Jennifer could be texting him and saying, don't respond to this or say this instead. And I don't know that, and I hope they don't do that. But you sort of have to come now, you have to come to that kind of understanding that everyone's sort of on an honor code with how you perform. And that it seems a little naive, but we're all practitioners. We all need to do what we have to do. And it's just, so you have to come, again, more comfortable understanding with what you do with that stuff. Another thing is trials. Now, I'm in New York. We haven't had trials in quite some time. There's no jury. They're starting jury trials now, I think next week is when they're trying to start the first one back up again. But what do you do with juries? What if there's an outbreak? The legal system kind of ground to a halt in this area, and it's starting to come back in certain states, but that's only subject to how fast the virus diminishes or if it accelerates rapidly again. And then what do you do there? And what happens to those who are waiting for their day in court? So that's something that the legal community as a whole, especially the judicial system, needs to sort of grapple with and figure out. And they're trying. I mean, I looked earlier at pictures, and there's the judge behind a giant glass enclosure, wearing a giant face mask, like she was in a hospital. And maybe that's the way forward for the future, but I don't know. And no one really seemed to know. And we're all trying to figure it out together. So that's one of the things that I hope as we're moving forward, that people who are actively involved in this space keep that in consideration and try to figure out a way to keep justice progressing, give people their chance and their day in court, which hasn't happened in quite some time. And the more this virus progresses, the more that may delay things even further. And also the idea that you need to be able to, as a partner or a senior associate or an organization, be respectful of the fact that while someone is home, that does not mean that they are always available. Like, we all know we're not going anywhere for the most part. I mean, if you are in a state where you can move more freely, then by all means. But just because it's now 9 o'clock at night and you decide you want something, it shouldn't be incumbent on the associate to not be able to not answer an email or have some time for themselves. Because now that we're at home, like, I can roll out of bed and start working immediately. But then I have no time for myself. There's no commuting to the office anymore. There's no taking time to have dinner or go to the gym, because you're always accessible. And it's very hard to say no when you're a junior associate and you're trying to make your bones in a company or a firm, to be accurate, and you can't say no because you feel awkward about saying no. So it really is now a matter on the partners and management to pull back a little bit and give the understanding to their associates that just because you are near a computer does not mean you should be accessible 24/7. Because that's another way to burn out associates and partners and staff. There's no break anymore at times, which is what I personally found. I can go from a Zoom meeting from 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, but we're not in an office and no one knows to schedule or give a break for lunch because we're all working on different schedules. And I'm just worn out by the end of it, which is fair. And it'll happen to everybody, disability or not disability. And that's just something I think the profession needs to come to terms with. Like, how do we now allow our attorneys and our law students to successfully thrive and not burn them out about the work as we are moving forward with this, unfortunately, go on for quite some time.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to stick with you here for a moment. So I think there's a consensus that in some ways, our sudden move to remote working and remote teaching has had some net positive for many people with disabilities, and it caused some of these accommodations to become universal. But certainly there have been some difficulties and barriers for individuals with certain kinds of disabilities. Could you talk, any of you, I'll start with Michael and then go around, what are some of the issues you've become aware of that other people generally might not be aware of, that actually were barriers for people with disabilities, notwithstanding the net good that came of some of the remote working?
Absolutely. So as I said, I'm hard of hearing. So Zoom has been great because now I'm finally able to have conversation and see people's faces and read their lips. But you can also have issues where you are someone who is deaf and cannot hear at all, and there's no closed captioning. And there's no sign language interpreter on the other end. So you have to sort of, now what do you do? And that is something that the firm and the companies that where you work have to work or figure out. These are not expensive things to provide, but they're things that need to be discussed and provided to give people that access to the workplace. You don't want someone shut out because they can't access the information that's on the screen or that's being circulated amongst everybody else. For another thing, if you're on a Zoom call, this may seem small, but everyone who's not talking should be muted, because what you'll hear in the background is background noise, which is hard for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to focus on the speaker because they hear other things at the same time. Another example is if you are blind, if you have low vision, then videos aren't always accessible because you have trouble seeing. So if someone's doing a Zoom presentation and they're not describing the slide because they're assuming the slide is doing all of the work for them, the person who's on the other end, who is blind, has low vision, is not gonna be able to see it. So then what do you do there? Then you have to make sure that that the presentation you're using, if they have low vision or if they're blind, do the best you can. Make the font big. Don't do huge slides with like very, very small details and small pictures. Share the slides in advance so people can see them and go over them in advance of the call if they can. Describe what's on the slide while you're talking. Don't just assume someone is staring at the screen, because Bob and Jennifer said you could be on a Zoom call but not staring at the screen the entire time. And that's something could be breastfeeding, could be something else happening. There's something else to be aware of. I mentioned this earlier about physical impairments. Zoom calls are exhausting. Just constantly working is exhausting. I don't have access to my standing desk that I had in my office, which was great. So now I'm sitting a lot, which is fine, but I need to move. My back hurts after a while, so do my legs. It's not conducive to the workplace for you to be in pain while you're trying to work. Those are the considerations that need to be given to have a break between it. If you're doing a meeting that's a Zoom call or a meeting anyways, have a 5-minute, 10-minute break. It doesn't cost much. And what people would do in a normal meeting, if you were in the office, you'd be like, let's take 5. But now you sort of have to be aware to build that in. Another thing is, in the issue of mental health, I have had many people say to me, I'm going quote unquote crazy at home right now, or these are crazy times where I'm going insane. The problem with those comments is it's disrespectful to people who have a mental issue, and then they may feel embarrassed to talk about it or share their issue with you. And they're sort of putting them in the proverbial closet because you're using these terms, which may seem fine to you, but they carry incredibly negative connotation. And that's not fair to anyone else that's on the other side of it. I have friends who I've been like, oh, how are you doing? And their response is, do you want my honest answer or do you want the one I give to everybody else? And I go, give me your honest answer. And they say, not that great, because this is draining, this is exhausting. I'm tired all the time. I'm watching the news is depressing. These are things that need to be taken into consideration as we are moving forward, that mental health should be a prime focus for companies and firms going forward, because these are not ordinary times. And in addition to COVID, we've had George Floyd murder, we've had other situations like that. And it's just a lot that's been going on in the community as a whole that people have to process. And it's tiring, and that sort of care needs to be given by companies and by employers.
Thanks, Michael. Super helpful. Jennifer, what have you seen in terms of students with disabilities or even professors with disabilities, some things that haven't worked so well during the last semester?
Michael did a really stellar job of highlighting some of those issues. And Bob and I have also alluded to some of them, but I wanted to bring everyone's specific attention to a couple of others. Firstly, you have to really remember and keep in mind what a broad spectrum of conditions that you're discussing when you talk about ADA covered disabilities, literally anything that has a substantial impact on your day-to-day life. And that would include things that people do think of as disabilities, things like mobility-related physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, but also other physical disabilities that we don't always think of, emotional disabilities, intrasystem disabilities, and many of those are made worse and exacerbated by COVID itself, but also by the social changes, as Michael alluded to, that we've made to protect ourselves from that physical illness. And so immediately, autoimmune diseases come to mind, asthma, other pulmonary diseases, even obesity, these things come to mind. But in addition to that, things like substance abuse, anxiety disorders, trauma and stress-related disorders, eating disorders, sleep-related disorders, things like chronic fatigue syndrome, those challenges, they're very multifaceted. And firstly, because a lot of students, they don't even recognize these conditions to be disabilities for which they may receive accommodation. And certainly if the students who are grappling with those disabilities don't understand them to be challenges that are appropriate or that require accommodation, a lot of times the professionals that they are working with, their professors don't necessarily recognize those conditions as disabilities that may require accommodation. So what happens traditionally is that a lot of these students are going to self-accommodate, or worse, they'll receive no support whatsoever from themselves, from their community, from the professors, or from the staff, an approach that would create problems if ever there is an exacerbation of the underlying condition. And so what we've seen in the immediate past, and really what's ongoing, is that the exacerbation of these conditions. The dean of students at Columbia, he's a very empathetic and very effective leader, oftentimes discusses what has happened this summer as something that's happening to all of us. So, we all can see those effects in the micro. For example, one thing that I think of is being up at 2 a.m. talking to my daughter, who's 13 years old, in like on a random Thursday or something, and realizing, wow, my sleep schedule is completely askew. Or you may hear of people taking a nightcap who wouldn't ordinarily take one. Or you may think of people who've reached a wall in terms of social distancing and are starting to sort of experience cabin fever to a ridiculous degree. Those experiences are also happening to students with disabilities, but the effects are potentially, much more harmful to them than other people who don't experience those conditions. And worse, something that's also sort of happening simultaneously, a lot of the students became effectively transient during the spring term. They didn't really have a permanent home. And that's a scenario that we could possibly anticipate going into the fall, with so many schools choosing to end the academic calendar right around fall break or Thanksgiving. Students may make different housing decisions than they ordinarily might. So what we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean pragmatically? It means, for a lot of students, interruptions in treatment, frankly. Particularly when you're in an environment where you have difficulty finding an in-person provider, or finding a person who is continuing to see would-be clients or patients, but are seeing them remotely. That's a barrier that I've walked a number of students through. For institutions that have very stringent accommodation processes that may, for instance, require a student to produce documentation term after term in order to receive accommodations, for students who have sort of overcome that initial challenge of not having accommodations at all, they have the accommodation, now they need to reproduce this documentation, but they don't necessarily have that ongoing relationship with that provider. Or perhaps they've experienced an unprecedented exacerbation of their disability, and for the first time they understand, or they feel that they really and urgently need help, but they cannot acquire the documentation that might be required for that disability. That's a consideration as well that I think that we don't necessarily always think about. And that's why I think universal design is such a powerful tool, because it really undercuts how problematic some of those things are. And I would just encourage everyone, the entire community, to address some of these concerns by implementing like very flexible, very common sense accommodation processes that really invest trust in students as adults with integrity, as the professionals that they're training to be, so that they can manage their needs appropriately, and we can manage their needs with grace and with introspection. And providing accommodations by default it's an incredibly important first step. And it's really one of the reasons why, for me, universal design for learning is such a beautiful and pragmatic pedagogical framework, particularly as someone who works with students with disabilities.
Thanks, Jennifer. Super helpful. And that really provides a good bridge to our last conversation and that we wanted to have. And I'm going to ask Bob to start on this one. So I think it's pretty clear that COVID itself has changed the way we need to think about disabilities and even how we define disabilities. And I think, for instance, we've talked about the fact that not everyone is going to come back to school or back to work at the same time. And immune compromised people, for instance, might be some of the last to come back to the classroom or come back to work. And there are issues around that, right? Will they be disadvantaged in some ways? Will they be stigmatized? How should the ongoing issue of the unevenness of all of this shape the way we're thinking about accommodations and planning as we go forward? Bob, start with you, and you can throw anything else you wanted to say and haven't had a chance to say yet into this one.
Okay, thanks. Well, luckily I've got two great co-panelists who cover a lot of the things that need to be said. I want to say something that really comes out of, it's kind of the standard playbook, if you will, of people who do disability rights and disability justice work, which is when we look at anything that is involving, what we should be doing as a society, our mantra should first start with nothing about us without us. We should be looking to people with disabilities themselves to help us figure out what works, especially as we're using a new kind of form or a format that is new for many of us. So some of the things we've been talking about, you don't realize that, if we're not putting stuff, if we have someone who's a visual learner and we're not using PowerPoint, and normally in a class, the student will be able to kind of get what they needed from the PowerPoint, and you're not making the slides available, that's going to be more difficult for them. So one thing I would say from a professor standpoint is the need to reach out and, test, and by asking, frankly, whether or not somebody is able to access the information in the way that they need it, and if not, if there are ways to make changes to that. There should be no kind of, pride of the professor who can't show vulnerability. And vulnerability, I think, for me, is one of the key points here, that we tend to think of vulnerability generally as an individual characteristic of somebody. They're not able in certain ways to do certain things. I think that's a false sense generally, but it's particularly true now. Everybody now is vulnerable in some way or other, even those who are managing reasonably well. And so as we think about that as a kind of almost universal condition, and there certainly are theorists who argue that that's true for us generally, then we need to think about how to respond to it in a more destigmatized way, a differentiated type of way. But that is difficult for, I think, very many people to kind of integrate into the way they think about themselves and the world. So I guess one thing one could say is that students with disabilities who have worked themselves up to or have understood their need to request accommodations and work through a process, and as Jennifer says, that can be very cumbersome at some schools, they at least have that sense. They have disability as part of their identity. They've understood especially as they get to the graduate school level, what they need to do well and what they need to show what they know, as opposed to the barriers that may be preventing that. For people who have been thrown into a COVID world, who didn't think of themselves as part of the disability club, all of a sudden to be thinking, oh, I need certain things that I didn't think I needed before. I think there's an attitudinal adjustment that is required there for everybody, really, both for the people providing the accommodations and then for the people needing to ask for it, and to asking for it not as something like, oh, please, sir, would you do me this favor, but as really a right, as an obligation that the institution has to the people so that we can deliver the product we want, which for a law school, is to train and educate our students, and for a law firm is to do the legal work that the firm has been assigned. And I think so those I think are important. And then I guess the third thing is there's the people who will not come back as quickly because of having conditions, and which may lead other people to wonder, well, what's going on with them. And then there are the people who have had COVID and recover and come back. And whether people will look at them and say, well, wait a second, you may think you're fine, but we don't even know whether if you've had it, you're immune now. You could be infecting other people. We don't want you in our environment. And given how dynamic and the situation is, our knowledge about this COVID virus changes every day in terms of what we know. Nobody's really can say, well, I know with certitude that if I've had it, that's it, and no one can get it from me. We don't know that. So I think we're going to see, I fear we might see some, frankly, rather ugly kinds of confrontations where people just aren't sure whether, because their life may be on the line, particularly if they are vulnerable. And then lastly, I just would say, because nothing is ever uncomplicated, we've already seen, these, and maybe others have, these not official, that they sort of pretends to be a Department of Justice statement of policy that the ADA says people don't need to wear masks. This has been out there. Actually, the Justice Department has had to come out and say, that's not us. We're not saying that. And mask raises a whole other set of issues, as we know, which is that we're saying now, and the scientists are saying, people need to be masked in their interactions when they're close to people. And that's great, but what about people with disabilities who cannot wear masks, who have respiratory kinds of conditions? What about people who need to lip read and can't therefore understand people who are wearing masks? And so we need to look at that the way we would look at disability accommodations generally and say, well, okay, are there other ways to achieve the goals of the employment setting or the public accommodation where we don't need the mask in other kinds of ways? And we could go into more detail about that, but the main point of it is everything we're doing to adapt, we have to think about how does this work for the general population? And as Jennifer says, that general population, it's not a special group of people who need particular things. It is part of the general community that has to be considered and through a universal design type of approach.
Thanks, Bob. Your mask reference is a perfect opportunity to turn to Michael again. And Michael, you've had some personal experiences and struggles with the mask world. And maybe I could ask you to just say a few words about that.
Yeah, it's terrible. So as I'm hard of hearing, and for anyone who's deaf or hard of hearing, lip reading, as I mentioned earlier, is very important to being able to effectively communicate, me being able to understand what someone is saying. And everyone lip reads to a certain extent. If you aren't deaf or hard of hearing, you don't realize how much you do it, but trust me, you do it. And for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, they do it a lot. But now the masks are up, and I can't make out what someone is saying. I have been at the store, I've been to the pharmacy, and someone starts talking to me on a counter, and I have to beg them essentially to yell because I cannot hear what they are saying, and the mask makes it impossible for me to follow what they're saying. Or I've turned to my brother and said, what did that person say? And sometimes they'll pull the mask down. We'll make sure we're a distance apart, 6 feet apart. But it's very tough to communicate effectively when I'm out and about as a result. And it's understandable that the masks have to be up, obviously, but the masks aren't coming with screens so you can see someone's lips. There are like Etsy shops or small producers who are making masks with that intention in mind, but those are by far the exception and not the norm. And so for myself, it's very difficult when I am out to communicate sometimes with people and follow this thing. So that's why it's the whole new world, so to speak.
And Michael, does that feel like in some ways you're forced to out yourself? I mean, is there stigma? Like in the ordinary world, you would read someone's lips and you would get your prescription from the pharmacy and off you would go. And now you're in a position where you have to self-identify as someone who needs to communicate differently with the person behind the counter.
Exactly. I will literally take my hearing aids and go like, oh, this is my hearing aid, I can't hear you. Because otherwise I think I'm just being difficult, and I'm not. I'm trying to have the conversation. So I have to constantly say, I have to apologize, which by itself is infuriating, because I shouldn't have to apologize for who I am. But I have to say, I'm sorry, but I'm hard of hearing, and try to get the conversation going that way. And for the most part, that works. But I am having to out myself. And it's just, sure, why not?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's, again, if you don't bring a lot of self-awareness about lip reading, it's an issue that just could be lost on many parts of the world here. In the few minutes before we turn to questions, Jennifer, I just wanted to give you an opportunity in terms of stigma and the question of COVID and people coming back or not coming back. What are the issues you've seen starting to manifest themselves on campus as you guys plan for fall, if any?
Well, I will just say that, based upon my own observed and lived experience, difference is stigmatized, period. And even where difference doesn't legitimately exist, it feels like people will create it. So I think that a lot of the conversation that we're having, simultaneously with these conversations about race can also be applied here when we discuss disability related difference. And I immediately sort of think of a lot of the anti-racism discussions that are being had at all levels of education. I think that a lot of the strategies employed there in many ways also can apply here. And I think that having conversations like this one are an important first step, because it indicates that the legal community acknowledges that there may be problems, that we collectively wish to address them, that we're assessing the situation, we're planning, we're goal setting to address those issues. But we just need to continue to go down that road. We need to make sure that the gains that sort of we were forced to make during this world of COVID continue, and that we keep in mind that there is no fixed target in this journey. It's a legitimately moving target, and that our standards of sufficiency and appropriateness are going to continue to change as best practices and accommodation change, as sort of the underlying basis of the approaches that we're making change. Like, as you mentioned earlier, what we did on the fly in March as opposed to what we're doing now with an entire summer's worth of preparation. So the work is truly ongoing. And I just think that at the end of the day, it's something that must be constantly evaluated and reevaluated.
Thanks. Super helpful. At this point, I'm going to turn to Amy Albright. And Amy, I'm going to ask you if there are questions that have come in for the panel that you would like to share with us.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I wanted to thank our esteemed panelists and our moderator. I think this is an amazing conversation and one that needs to continue. So first question. What are schools doing for students who require an isolated, quiet place as part of exam accommodations while exams are remote? And I know we've been hearing this question a lot. It's concerning a lot of students.
Bob or Jennifer, either one, want to jump in on that?
Well, all I can say, I mean, one thing that we are doing, and I think probably many schools are doing, all our exams are going to be online in the spring. And that was, I mean, in the fall, that was true in the spring. So some of the kinds of accommodations that you would normally do may not be that hard to do if a student is in a situation in their home where they may be able to have that kind of isolation. I would say if they are not, and of course many would not be, one of the things that they would be able to do with us is our building will be open and we will have some students who will be there. We have a much lower capacity for the building than normally because we have to maintain distancing, but we would make rooms available for them, with the appropriate computer hookup for them to be able to participate and take their exams that way. And, we're also going to make the exams open book. I mean, some of my colleagues want to be on and closed book, but we want to not create situations that are problematic and difficult for us to supervise.
Jennifer, how about at Columbia? Has that issue come up or have you talked that through at all?
I don't think that particular issue has come up, but the idea generally that there may be accommodations that are needed that are not traditionally even considered by students is a conversation that I've had with a number of students, and sort of proactively thinking about what it is I will actually need in the fall to be successful, and then taking the impetus of making that ask. I think that falls into that category. Like this would be effectively a new accommodation for students if you're talking about a quiet space, even within the context of a remotely conducted exam.
Yeah, it's true. It's just the fact patterns are endless in their novelty. What else do you have for us, Amy?
Okay, this is another very good question. What do we do to provide equity in education when schools offer in-person classes, but many disabled students are high risk and can only attend online? How do we keep that balance? How do we keep that equity? And have we begun to think about that?
So let me jump in to start with an answer there, and others can participate. One is that what we will be doing in the fall is that our first year students, and I think somebody earlier said, I think it was Michael talking about a first year associate. One of the challenges we'll be facing is it's one thing to go online in March when you've had a whole class and connection in person with a group, and then you move online. It's another when there is no pre-existing community, and I think that's something which all schools are facing. So in our case, we will have every first year section, one class in that section in a doctrinal area like torts or contracts will be in person. Now it won't be the usual 80-person section because we can't have 80 people in the room at the same time. It's going to be divvied up in a 25 or 30 or so, and then kind of vary that way. What we are doing to try to equalize, because we've said to any student who does not want to be in the building does not have to be there, they're not required to be there. Any classes that are being taught in person in part will be simulcast with other people who'll be able to participate remotely. And I would say that the job of us as educators, as the law school faculty, is in the same way we would about accessibility for people with disabilities generally, to make sure that the alternative we are offering in online puts the person in as equal a situation as we can with regard to the people in person. And finally, I would just say, this is not going to be your mother or father's in-person education. You're going to be socially distanced. You're going to be wearing masks. It's probably not going to be very satisfying. This is not at all to say we shouldn't do all the things I just said, but it just means that in a sense, the comparator is not going to be what you imagine in-person education was like beforehand. That's going to be different. Some might say better, some might say worse. And then what we're doing remotely is going to have to approximate as closely as we can what's going on in the classroom. And finally, since one of the things we want to do is make opportunities for students to gather informally, consistent with the CDC guidelines, we want to also make sure that's made available to people who are only going to be with us remotely. So if there's going to be small group gatherings or study groups and all that, we're going to make sure that people who are participating online have as equal access to that as people who are there in person.
Thanks so much, Bob. Jennifer, have you guys had the equity conversation and raised other issues that might come about as we enter the hybrid phase of this?
I think that's been an ongoing conversation, exploring the pragmatics of what that looks like. And I think it's become, even more pressing with simultaneous issues such as the regulations and limitations that were just pushed through from ICE and things of that nature. We found all of these things just increasingly intersecting. And I think the entire community is trying to make sure that we're exploring options that we may not have necessarily considered before in terms of what these modalities will look like, in terms of how students are able to participate in those modalities. And I have my own individual ideas about what that could look like if I were to switch from my administrative hat to my teacher hat, but that's not necessarily as relevant. But I do think it's a continuing conversation, and it's something that I think it changes week by week as all of these new factors come into play. And of course, we're also limited by city and state guidance in New York City, just by virtue of where we are.
Right. Amy, are there any questions that touch on employment or law firms? We can draw Michael into this.
Yeah. So with regard to newer attorneys, any suggestions for help building structure, particularly those who may have ADHD or other focus issues? Some staff have reported that the office gives them a structure, and really that's beyond just people with ADHD. So working home doesn't give you that structure. So any thoughts on that for people that are floundering, for people that are struggling with this issue of structure? Because many of us, even without a disability, structure is tough when you're home all the time.
So I think the best way to do that, you almost have to do it yourself. So I try to, when I get up in the morning, exercise, maybe watch like an hour of the news, and then work out, and then start working, and then around 12:30, have lunch, then go back to work, and then around 5 o'clock stop. And I almost have to set up for myself an internal schedule, or even a written out schedule, so I can manage my own time, and I can and I'm building myself in a break. Like I can look at my calendar and see if I have calls for that day, if I have meetings that need to be handled, or a deposition, mediation, what have you. But if I can't get that structure of the office, then I have to sort of create it myself. So I used to commute into the city for work. I live on Long Island, and I would have to be at the train by a certain time, get on the train, I'd get into Penn Station at a certain time, then I'd walk to my office, and I knew where that schedule was, and I knew when I'd have to leave, and you have to now do it for yourself. And it's easier said than done, but it helps to sort of break up the day. And also that not every day feels like a never ending one. Like how is today is the day that ends in Y. And that's true. But the problem is that, there has to be a break for yourself, or just because you need it. This isn't fun. There's no going to the office. There's no after work networking or meeting friends. So you have to sort of build it in now for yourself.
Are there things that you think that that supervisors can do to help their new attorneys build in that kind of structure, to be very proactive with new attorneys?
I did. I think the supervisors, like in my firm, we are assigned mentees, which are first year associates and second year associates. And those mentors, as well as the informal ones that the mentees have in their practice, need to step in and say, look, this is what you have to do for yourself. Take some time here, take some time there. I will talk to a senior partner for you if you feel uncomfortable doing it. Reach out to those people because they will be there, the ones to help you out. And that's a way you can do it. It's awkward, I know from my personal experience, but you have to sort of do those things and have people looking out for you, which is what the firm should be doing, to ensure that you can do the work you need to do while also getting the breaks that you need.
I mean, my sense is that anyone who has a supervisory role of any sort or is responsible for a team has a heightened responsibility during this time to check in on them and check on their mental and emotional health, check on how their schedule's going, making sure they are maintaining some structures and support systems for themselves. And if they're floundering with that, working with them, stepping outside of the supervisor role and becoming the mentor or sponsor in the moment and trying to help them build those structures for themselves. Some people have really transitioned super well to this new environment, and some people have really struggled. And that's just, people of different Myers-Briggs types and different problem solving skills and different predispositions and different levels of need for structure. And I've seen it in my own team. Just the need to, it's again, the insight from the disability accommodation world. Every employee in some ways needs to be accommodated in a different way, in a way that's personal, that works for them. And some folks, particularly more junior in their career, may just need some help getting there. So I think we all have that responsibility.
And I would add, in addition to being, in a mentor-mentee relationship, modeling some of that behavior. So if you're a more senior person,
Bob.
taking time to take for self-care, you know. I will say this, I mean, admit all, you know, I've been pretty, my wife and I are, you know, our kids are grown, and so it's just the two of us. We've been pretty good about, you know, not having much interaction. The one thing we do absolutely every day is we take a long walk in the neighborhood, and, you know, the length of the walk is built up over time. I absolutely look forward to it. And it is a way to be able to, you know, to make sure that I'm taking care of not just the head, but you know, the rest of me as well. So in some ways, I'm doing better at that now than I would normally, when I would be rushing off and, you know, trying to get in the car and get to work on time and grabbing lunch on the fly.
Yeah, I agree, Bob. I mean, I have fallen in love with DC all over again. I have walked streets that I have never walked. And that time walking, whether it's in the first thing in the morning or after work, has been super important to me as well. I know we're just about at time here. Jennifer, do you have any last words or reflections that you wanted to share?
Just that I really enjoyed participating, and I hope that our experiences are able to support students with disabilities as they continue through law school and as they embark on their careers, and that they, you know, make sure that they add their voices to the conversation and continue to advocate for themselves and for others to whatever degree they are comfortable with.
Well, I deeply appreciate the participation of all three of you. I wanted to thank Jennifer and Bob and Michael for your time, both in preparing for this webinar and in spending time in this conversation this afternoon. As I said at the beginning, this has been recorded. We will be making the link to the recording available both through the ABA and through NALP. The section for civil rights and social justice has an ongoing webinar series, and there is more information available about that on their webpage within the ABA, and we encourage you to check that out. We thank Amy for her support in putting this together. We thank Ali for her support, and Judy Perry-Martinez for setting this work in motion at the beginning of her term. We wish everybody the best of luck in getting through this period of time we're in. Stay safe and be well, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.